Welcome back, dear listener. In the last part of our journey, we explored the origins of the geisha, their beginnings, their early traditions, and the fragile foundations of a world that would soon become timeless. Now, in this new chapter, we step deeper into their story. Together, we will discover how their training grew more rigorous, how their communities formed stronger bonds, and how the floating world began to shape not only entertainment, but the very culture of Japan. So, wherever you are listening from, and whatever time it is for you, make yourself comfortable, take a deep breath, and let us continue our journey into the elegant and mysterious world of the geisha. The death of Emperor Meiji in 1912 marked the end of an age of transformation and the beginning of a new chapter in Japan's history. The Taisho period that followed was short but significant, lasting only until 1926. Yet it brought with it cultural shifts that deeply affected the world of the geisha. If the Meiji era had been about survival through adaptation, the Taisho era was about navigating the tension between tradition and the growing forces of modernity, democracy, and mass culture. Japan during the Taisho years was marked by contrasts. Politically, the nation experienced a relative liberalization, often referred to as Taisho democracy. Parliamentary politics flourished, newspapers multiplied, and a new sense of civic participation emerged. At the same time, Japan expanded its empire abroad, asserting itself as a modern power on the global stage. Cities grew rapidly, technology advanced, and Western fashions spread further, filling the streets with images of modern life. For the geisha, these years were both an opportunity and a challenge. Their profession had survived the upheavals of the Meiji era, but the social climate of Taisho Japan demanded new strategies. Patrons now included not only industrialists and politicians, but also writers, journalists, and artists associated with the liberal culture of the time. Many of these new patrons were fascinated by the geisha as both a symbol of tradition and a figure of independence. A woman whose wit and artistry set her apart from the domestic roles still assigned to most women. Artistic experimentation flourished in this era, and geisha were not untouched by it. Dance schools expanded their repertoires, sometimes incorporating theatrical elements influenced by Western performance. Shamisen compositions absorbed new rhythms and melodies, blending the old with the new. Public performances became more common, with geisha appearing on larger stages, sometimes in theaters that mixed kabuki, Western plays, and traditional dances. This visibility reinforced their role as cultural custodians, while also positioning them within the broader entertainment industry that was rapidly modernizing. The rise of mass media reshaped their image. Photographs and postcards of geisha circulated widely, often sold as souvenirs to both Japanese citizens and foreign visitors. Magazines featured articles and serialized stories about geisha life, romanticizing their elegance while sometimes sensationalizing their struggles. Films, still in their infancy, occasionally included geisha characters, further spreading their image beyond the confines of the tea house. For many in Taisho Japan, geisha became part of a shared cultural imagination, visible not only in festivals and banquets, but also in the pages of newspapers and the flicker of cinema screens. Yet the realities of their lives remained as demanding as ever. The ukiyo system persisted, with debts binding apprentices to their houses. Training continued to be rigorous, with long hours dedicated to shamisen, dance, calligraphy, and conversation. kimono costs remained exorbitant, and the pressure to maintain flawless appearances grew even heavier in an era when photographs and magazines made their image widely public. Behind the glamour, fatigue and financial burden continued to shape their daily existence. Social perceptions were mixed. On one hand, geisha were admired as icons of tradition, their refinement seen as a counterbalance to the rush of modern life. On the other, critics argued that they were outdated, distractions from the democratic and educational reforms Japan sought to embrace. Feminist thinkers of the Taisho period, many of whom advocated for women's rights and broader opportunities, sometimes criticized the geisha system as one that commodified women's presence rather than granting them true freedom. These debates reflected the broader tensions of the age, between tradition and modernity, art and commerce, symbolism and reality. For the geisha themselves, adaptation was once again the key to survival. Some embraced the modern spirit, experimenting with Western fashions or engaging with journalists and writers who sought their perspective. Others doubled down on tradition, presenting themselves as guardians of heritage untouched by foreign influence. Most navigated a path between the two, preserving the essence of their art while adjusting to the shifting tastes of patrons and society. Internationally, geisha continued to fascinate. Foreign visitors to Japan during the Taisho era often sought encounters with them, eager to experience what they believed to be the heart of Japanese culture. Travel accounts, photographs, and films spread their image abroad, reinforcing both admiration and misunderstanding. To Western eyes, the geisha remained exotic figures, often conflated with courtesans, yet also celebrated as symbols of elegance. By the end of the Taisho period in 1926, the geisha had weathered yet another transformation. They had maintained their relevance in a rapidly changing society, adapted their art to new contexts, and secured their place in the imagination of both Japan and the world. Yet new challenges loomed on the horizon. The rise of militarism, the onset of the Showa era, and the eventual approach of global conflict would soon test them in ways the Meiji and Taisho years had not. Daily life for a geisha during the Taisho era reflected both the continuity of centuries-old traditions and the subtle adjustments required by a rapidly modernizing society. The ukiyo remained the foundation of geisha life, just as it had in the Edo and Meiji periods. Yet its role adapted to the cultural and economic shifts of the early 20th century. Within the ukiyo, the rhythms of apprenticeship persisted. Young girls still entered as shikomi, their days filled with chores that tested their patience and discipline. They scrubbed floors, washed kimono, and fetched supplies, all while observing their elder sisters prepare for banquets. The lessons absorbed during these silent observations were as important as any formal training. The sight of a senior geisha adjusting her kimono with practiced precision, or rehearsing shamisen melodies with focused calm, imprinted itself on the apprentices, preparing them for their own journeys. Once a shikomi demonstrated readiness, she advanced to maiko, an apprentice geisha. The transition was marked by ceremony, a moment of celebration within the ukiyo and the wider Hanamachi district. For the young girl, it meant entering a world of color and responsibility. Her kimono became more elaborate, her hairstyles adorned with seasonal ornaments, her presence more visible at banquets and festivals. Yet it also meant long hours of formal training, rehearsals, and the careful guidance of her Oni-san, the elder sister to whom she was bound in mentorship. The bond between Oni-san and Imuto remained central to geisha training. The senior geisha taught her apprentice not only the mechanics of performance, but also the subtleties of atmosphere. She instructed her on how to listen as much as to speak, how to gauge the mood of guests, how to balance wit with restraint. These lessons were intangible, yet essential, shaping the apprentice into more than a performer, into a creator of the presence. Formal education in the arts deepened during the Taisho era. Dance schools grew more structured, often tied to specific lineages that codified repertoire and technique. Apprentices practiced tirelessly, perfecting seasonal dances that embodied the cycles of nature. The cherry blossom dance of spring, the firefly dance of summer, the autumn leaf dance, and the winter snow dance remained staples, their gestures refined into timeless sequences. But alongside these classics, newer dances appeared, some influenced by kabuki theater or Western performance styles. The balance between tradition and novelty defined the training of the time. Shamisen practice remained demanding. Apprentices learned to coax a range of emotions from the three strings, from playful melodies to haunting ballads. The Taisho era saw the composition of new songs that reflected modern life. Verses about trains, gas lamps, or bustling city streets, woven into the repertoire alongside older pieces. These innovations reminded both geisha and patrons that their art was alive, responsive to the world beyond the tatami room. Other skills were also cultivated. Calligraphy lessons emphasized balance and elegance, while poetry composition trained apprentices to capture fleeting beauty in words. Conversation practice became increasingly important, especially as patrons grew more diverse and included journalists, writers, and even foreigners. Some ukiyo arranged for apprentices to study fragments of English or Western etiquette, preparing them to host international guests. These additions reflected the new global dimension of Japan's culture in the early 20th century. Daily routines were rigorous. Mornings were devoted to practice. Shamisen scales repeated until fingers ached. Dances rehearsed until movements were seamless. Verses of poetry composed and recited. Afternoons involved preparation, selecting kimono, arranging hairstyles, applying makeup. Evenings brought ozashiki banquets, where training transformed into performance, where every gesture, song, and laugh carried both artistic weight and financial significance. Nights stretched late, leaving little rest before the cycle began again. The demands of beauty also shaped daily life. Hairstyles, elaborate and heavy, required sleeping on wooden pillows to preserve their form. Kimono, layered and tied with intricate obi, were stunning but burdensome, testing endurance as much as elegance. Makeup, applied with care, created an image of serenity that concealed fatigue. These physical demands underscored the paradox of geisha life. Refinement achieved through discipline, elegance sustained by sacrifice. Despite the hardships, moments of intimacy and joy punctuated their days. Shared meals in the ukiyo, laughter among sisters, quiet walks to shrines before dawn, all offered relief from the pressures of performance. The bonds of sisterhood were often the strongest source of resilience, sustaining apprentices through years of debt and discipline. Festivals and public appearances added another layer to daily life. Participation in seasonal events gave apprentices visibility. allowing them to showcase their art to broader audiences. For many Maiko, a successful festival performance could attract patrons and secure their future within the profession. These occasions were also moments of pride, reminders that their art was not confined to private banquets, but belonged to the rhythms of community life. In the Taisho era, modernization made its way even into the routines of ukiyo. Electric lights replaced lanterns in some districts. Newspapers delivered stories of geisha to households across the nation, and gramophones recorded the voices and shamisen melodies of famous performers. These technologies altered the relationship between geisha and the public, extending their presence beyond the immediate spaces of tea houses and festivals. Apprentices grew up aware that their image could circulate far beyond their own city, adding pressure but also opportunity. Life in the ukiyo during the Taisho years was thus both traditional and modern, disciplined and adaptive. The apprentices carried forward rituals centuries old, yet also learned to adjust to the rhythms of a new age. Their lives were marked by fatigue, debt, and sacrifice, yet also by pride, artistry, and the fleeting joys of impermanence. They embodied the paradox of geisha existence. Blossoms nurtured in gardens of discipline, blooming briefly yet brilliantly, their beauty both fragile and enduring. The Taisho era was not only a time of political liberalization and cultural experimentation, it was also a time of profound economic change. Japan's cities grew larger than ever. Industrialization accelerated, and a new middle class emerged alongside traditional elites. For the geisha, whose lives had always been shaped by financial realities as much as artistry, these shifts created both opportunities and challenges. The ukiyo remained the cornerstone of the geisha economy. Each house operated as both family and business, investing heavily in the training, attire, and reputation of its members. The cost of becoming a geisha in the Taisho period was higher than ever. Kimono, already expensive, became even more elaborate with imported fabrics and dyes. Hairstyles demanded not only skill, but costly ornaments, crafted by artisans whose work was highly prized. Training in shamisen, dance, and calligraphy required payments to instructors, while public appearances often necessitated further investment and preparation. Every step of a geisha's career was underwritten by debt, carefully recorded by the oka-san, who expected eventual repayment through engagements and patronage. The presence of dana patrons remained central to this system, though their identities shifted. In the Edo and early Meiji periods, samurai and wealthy merchants had been the primary supporters of geisha. By the Taisho years, these figures were replaced by industrial magnates, bankers, government officials, and cultural elites. For these men, becoming a dana was not only about companionship, but also about prestige. To support a celebrated geisha signaled refinement, success, and participation in Japan's cultural life. A dana typically assumed responsibility for covering the debts of his chosen geisha, as well as providing for her attire and training. This financial support granted him exclusivity, though the nature of the relationship varied. Some arrangements were affectionate and enduring, while others were pragmatic, rooted in social display rather than intimacy. For geisha, securing a dana could mean liberation from the heaviest financial burdens, granting her more independence to focus on her art. Yet, it also meant entering into a relationship that could limit her freedom. tying her fate to the fortunes of her patron. The rise of the middle class introduced new dynamics. While many could not afford the expenses of becoming full patrons, they increasingly participated in geisha culture through public performances, festivals, and less exclusive banquets. This democratization of access expanded the economic base of geisha districts, ensuring their continued prosperity. Geisha, who once might have performed only for elite merchants or politicians, now found themselves entertaining groups of clerks, teachers, or journalists. Though these engagements were less lucrative than those of elite patrons, they broadened the reach of geisha culture, embedding it more deeply in urban life. At the same time, mass media reshaped the economics of geisha life. Photographs, postcards, and recordings of famous geisha created celebrities whose fame extended far beyond their local districts. A celebrated geisha might find her image sold in shops or printed in newspapers, bringing prestige to her ukiyo and attracting new patrons. Yet this fame was double-edged. While it offered opportunities for increased income, it also heightened expectations and scrutiny. Maintaining celebrity status required even greater investment in attire, training, and performance, further entangling geisha in cycles of debt and repayment. The economic ripple effects of geisha culture extended into broader society. Kimono makers, hairdressers, musicians, and artisans all depended on geisha patronage. Festivals and public performances stimulated local economies, drawing visitors who filled inns, restaurants, and markets. In this way, the financial world of the geisha was not isolated, but deeply interconnected with urban commerce. Districts like Gion in Kyoto or Shinbashi in Tokyo thrived not only because of the geisha themselves, but because of the networks of artisans and businesses their presence sustained. Yet the economic pressures of the profession remained immense. Not every apprentice secured a wealthy dana. Not every geisha achieved fame. For many, debts lingered. Their lives defined more by financial struggle than by artistic triumph. Stories circulated of geisha forced into exhausting schedules, performing at multiple banquets in a single night, their earnings barely covering the costs of kimono and lessons. The glamour seen by patrons masked the relentless economic calculations underlying every performance. The Taisho period also brought new anxieties about the sustainability of the geisha system. Critics argued that the reliance on debt and patronage was exploitative, a relic of the feudal past that clashed with the ideals of democracy and modernity. Some reformers called for regulation of ukiyo practices, while others suggested that geisha culture should be abolished altogether. These debates reflected not only moral concerns, but also economic realities, as Japan grappled with how to reconcile tradition with modernization. Despite these challenges, the geisha economy endured, precisely because it was adaptive. Ukiyo adjusted their practices to attract new patrons, sometimes offering shorter-term financial arrangements rather than lifelong obligations. Geisha adapted their performances to appeal to broader audiences, ensuring steady income. Some even embraced modern technologies, making gramophone recordings or appearing in films, expanding their reach beyond the tatami room. These innovations allowed geisha to participate in the modern economy, while preserving the essence of their art. The economics of the Taisho geisha world thus reflected the broader paradox of their existence. Refinement sustained by financial burden, beauty underpinned by debt, independence limited by dependence. Yet within this paradox lay their resilience. They transformed financial constraint into elegance, turning the obligations of debt into the discipline of art. They reminded society that even in an age of factories and stock markets, the value of beauty and impermanence could not be measured in coins alone. By the end of the Taisho period, the geisha had proven once again that survival depended on adaptability. Their world remained expensive, demanding, and fragile, yet it continued to thrive. The debts were heavy, but the dances were graceful. The burdens immense, but the beauty unforgettable. They embodied a truth that transcended economics, that art endures not by resisting reality, but by transforming it, weaving hardship into elegance and impermanence into immortality. The Taisho era was a time of artistic experimentation and cultural expansion. Writers, poets, painters, and filmmakers sought new ways to express the identity of a nation, poised between tradition and modernity. In this creative ferment, the geisha emerged once again as a muse, a figure who embodied refinement and impermanence, while also reflecting the contradictions of a rapidly changing society. Visual art continued to place geisha at the center of Japanese aesthetics. Though ukiyo woodblock prints declined in popularity with the rise of photography and lithography, many artists still turned to geisha as subjects. Their graceful poses, elaborate kimono, and serene expressions made them ideal symbols of beauty. Yet Taisho depictions often contained new elements. A geisha strolling past electric lamps, a maiko captured against the backdrop of a railway bridge, or a performance framed by the architecture of modern theaters. These images highlighted the coexistence of tradition and progress, suggesting that the geisha were not relics, but living participants in modern Japan. Photography reinforced this image. Studios in Kyoto, Tokyo, and Osaka produced countless postcards featuring geisha in carefully staged poses, pouring tea, playing shamisen, or gazing pensively into the distance. These postcards circulated widely, purchased by tourists and mailed abroad, turning geisha into one of Japan's most recognizable cultural exports. For many foreigners, the postcard geisha became synonymous with the nation itself. Elegant, mysterious, timeless. Yet for the geisha themselves, this visibility was both empowering and confining. They became celebrities, their images known far beyond their districts, but also stereotypes, their individuality reduced to archetypes of beauty. Literature of the Taisho era frequently featured geisha characters. Novelists used them to explore themes of love, duty, and the tension between tradition and modernity. Some works romanticize them as tragic heroines, caught in relationships with patrons or struggling against the constraints of the ukiyo. Others celebrated their wit, resilience, and artistry, presenting them as women who could outshine men in conversation and hold their own in the changing world. These stories reflected both fascination and critique, revealing society's ambivalence toward geisha, admiration for their refinement, suspicion of their independence, and curiosity about their private lives. Poetry, too, embraced geisha as subjects. Haiku and tanka poets described fleeting encounters in ozashiki banquets or glimpses of geisha during festivals. Their verses captured the essence of mono no aware, the awareness of impermanence. In images of a fan unfolding, a sleeve brushing the tatami, a smile fading with the dawn. For poets, geisha embodied the transient beauty of life itself, symbols of moments that could never be repeated. The new medium of cinema added another dimension. Japanese filmmakers, inspired by both kabuki theater and Western film, began to include geisha characters in their early productions. These films often depicted geisha as central figures in melodramas, their lives framed as stories of love, sacrifice, and impermanence. While sometimes simplistic, these portrayals brought geisha to audiences far beyond the tea house, ensuring their place in the cultural imagination of the modern age. Some geisha themselves even appeared on screen, though usually in staged or symbolic roles, blurring the line between reality and representation. The relationship between geisha and artists was not one-sided. Many geisha cultivated friendships with painters, poets, and writers, serving as both muses and collaborators. They inspired verses, posed for portraits, and exchanged letters with literary figures. Some even composed their own poetry, their verses revealing the inner lives hidden behind the serene masks of performance. In these creative exchanges, geisha were not passive subjects, but active participants in the artistic currents of their time. Foreign artists and writers also contributed to the geisha's image. Western painters visiting Japan created sketches and watercolors of geisha, often idealizing them as symbols of exotic beauty. Travel writers described their encounters in florid prose, sometimes admiring their artistry, sometimes reducing them to stereotypes. These accounts, though often inaccurate, amplified the fascination with geisha abroad, making them central to the West's imagination of Japan. The cultural role of geisha in the Taisho era thus extended far beyond entertainment. They were symbols of continuity in a world of change, muses for artists seeking to capture the essence of Japan, and celebrities whose images circulated through postcards, novels, and films. Their presence in art and literature reassured citizens that tradition endured, even as modernization transformed every corner of life. Yet these representations also obscured reality. The struggles of debt, fatigue, and limited freedom were rarely depicted. Art focused on their beauty, literature on their romance, poetry on their fleeting grace. The gap between image and reality widened, turning geisha into symbols at the cost of their individuality. This paradox, visibility without full understanding, was central to their place in Taisho culture. Still, the geisha embraced their role as muses, knowing that art preserved what daily life could not. Their images, their songs, their gestures were immortalized in works that would endure long after individual names were forgotten. In inspiring art, they transcended impermanence, achieving a kind of immortality through representation. The Taisho era was thus not only a time of economic and political change, but a cultural flowering in which geisha played a vital role. They were at once subjects and creators, muses and artists, symbols and individuals. Their presence in art and literature revealed the enduring power of refinement in a modernizing world, reminding society that beauty, however fleeting, was essential to the human spirit. The Taisho era was a moment in Japanese history when society itself seemed to be in motion. The nation was opening more fully to global currents, politics grew livelier with parliamentary debate, and the rhythms of urban life shifted under the influence of mass media, electric lights, and new technologies. Within this changing society, geisha remained visible, admired, and debated, their presence shaping and reflecting how people thought about tradition, modernity, and identity. For the urban elite, the politicians, industrialists, and cultural leaders of the time, the geisha continued to embody refinement, Invitations to an ozashiki banquet in Gion or Shinbashi carried prestige, marking the host as a man of taste and sophistication. These evenings, illuminated by lanterns and filled with shamisen melodies, offered a refuge from the noise of modern cities. They were spaces where alliances were nurtured, deals were sealed, and reputations polished. To entertain guests with the presence of geisha was to display one's success, not only in wealth, but in cultural discernment. The emerging middle class, however, experienced geisha in new ways. While few could afford the exclusivity of intimate banquets, they encountered geisha through festivals, public performances, postcards, and newspapers. Middle-class families in Osaka or Tokyo might purchase a photograph of a celebrated geisha, displaying it in their home as a symbol of refinement. Young men boasted of glimpsing geisha in the streets of Kyoto, while women imitated their hairstyles and kimono patterns on a modest scale. For the middle class, geisha represented aspiration, figures who embodied a lifestyle just beyond their reach, yet close enough to inspire imitation. For the working poor, perceptions were more ambivalent. Many had daughters who became apprentices in ukiyo, sent into training as a means of survival. For these families, geisha life represented both opportunity and sacrifice. A successful geisha could bring prestige and financial support. Yet the path was fraught with debt and discipline. Among ordinary workers, the sight of a geisha might provoke admiration for her beauty, but also awareness of the burdens hidden behind the silk and powder. Women outside the profession often held complex views. On one hand, geisha embodied independence, moving freely in spaces where most women were excluded, conversing with powerful men, and commanding influence. To some, this made them role models, symbols of possibility in a patriarchal society. On the other hand, their proximity to male patrons and their freedom from domestic duties provoked suspicion. Wives sometimes resented the attention their husbands gave to geisha, while reform-minded women criticized the system as one that commodified femininity. Yet, even in critique, fascination lingered, for geisha represented an alternative mode of womanhood that both challenged and unsettled conventional norms. The media of the Taisho period amplified these perceptions. Newspapers ran serialized stories about geisha romances, often portraying them as heroines of tragic love or as witty companions whose presence illuminated the lives of men. Magazines featured photographs and interviews, presenting geisha as celebrities whose elegance could be admired from afar. Films introduced them to audiences who had never set foot in a tea house, casting them in roles that blended reality and fiction. Through these channels, the image of the geisha became part of everyday life, accessible even to those far removed from the floating world. Criticism, however, grew alongside admiration. Intellectuals and reformers debated the place of geisha in a modern nation. Some argued that they were outdated relics of a feudal past, incompatible with the democratic spirit of Taisho society. Others condemned the debts and obligations of the ukiyo system as exploitative. Feminist thinkers in particular challenged the profession, arguing that celebrating geisha as symbols of culture obscured the broader inequalities faced by women. To them, geisha represented both empowerment and constraint. Women who wielded influence in elite spaces, yet whose lives were still shaped by patronage and debt. Despite such critiques, geisha retained a powerful hold on the imagination of the public. Their presence at festivals reassured citizens that tradition remained alive amid modernization. Their appearances in postcards and newspapers allowed people across the nation to participate in the allure of refinement. Even critics who sought to diminish their role could not deny their cultural significance. The geisha had become too deeply woven into the identity of modern Japan to be dismissed. For the geisha themselves, navigating these perceptions was part of daily life. They were aware of the admiration, the envy, the criticism, and the fascination. They knew that their image carried symbolic weight far beyond their personal lives. Some embraced this role with pride, seeing themselves as ambassadors of refinement. Others felt constrained by it, longing for recognition as individuals rather than symbols. Yet together, they endured, embodying the paradox of impermanence. Visible everywhere, yet fleeting in their personal influence. Admired as icons, yet burdened as women. By the end of the Taisho period, the geisha had secured their place in the imagination of the nation. They were admired and criticized, envied and resented, celebrated and scrutinized. But above all, they were present, woven into the fabric of society, their image carried by festivals, media, and art. In a Japan that was both modern and traditional, democratic and imperial, restless and refined, the geisha stood as living reminders of the enduring power of beauty, impermanence, and grace. The death of Emperor Taisho in 1926 ushered in the Showa era, a reign that would stretch for more than 6 decades and encompass some of the most dramatic events in Japanese history. The early years of Showa were marked by turbulence, economic depression, the rise of militarism, and eventually the march toward war. For the geisha, who had survived the upheavals of Edo, Meiji, and Taisho, this new age brought both continuity and unprecedented challenges. The 1930s began with uncertainty. The global depression of 1929 reached Japan swiftly, shrinking incomes and reducing the number of patrons who could afford the luxury of geisha entertainment. Ukiyo across the country struggled to balance their books, while many apprentices faced even heavier debts as the cost of kimono and training remained high. Engagements grew less frequent, and some geisha districts contracted, closing tea houses or consolidating resources. Yet even in hardship, the geisha endured, finding ways to adapt, as they always had. Nationalism and militarism increasingly shaped the cultural climate. The government promoted values of sacrifice, discipline, and loyalty to the emperor. Ideals that resonated uneasily with the refined and playful atmosphere of the floating world. Some critics argued that geisha represented decadence, distractions from the seriousness of the national mission. Reformers demanded stricter regulations on entertainment districts, seeking to align cultural life with the goals of the state. But the state also recognized the symbolic value of geisha. Just as in the Meiji period, they were presented as embodiments of Japanese tradition, cultural jewels to be preserved even as the nation mobilized for war. Geisha appeared at patriotic events, performing dances that celebrated loyalty and sacrifice. Their seasonal performances, once centered on blossoms, fireflies, and moonlight, increasingly included themes of national pride. Shamisen melodies and dances were adapted to incorporate patriotic songs, blending tradition with propaganda. For the geisha themselves, these adjustments were both burdensome and necessary. They had long been experts at adapting to the desires of their patrons, and in this era, the state itself became one of those patrons. To continue performing, to secure their survival, geisha had to align their art with the cultural narratives of nationalism. Yet even as they performed patriotic dances, they retained the essence of their tradition: elegance, refinement, and the fleeting brilliance of impermanence. The presence of soldiers and officers as patrons altered the atmosphere of ozashiki banquets. Military men, flush with pride and often with government resources, filled tea houses with energy. For them, evenings with geisha were moments of escape from duty, yet also affirmations of the values they claimed to defend. Geisha entertained them with laughter, music, and subtle wit, offering temporary relief from the weight of militarism. Yet these encounters also reminded geisha of the shifting priorities of their world: the dominance of nationalism, the looming shadow of war. The growing influence of mass media in the 1930s reinforced the image of geisha as both cultural icons and national symbols. Newspapers and magazines featured photographs of geisha participating in patriotic festivals, while films depicted them as figures who embodied both tradition and loyalty to the nation. Recordings of shamisen music carried patriotic verses, spreading geisha performances far beyond the tea house. These representations reinforced the idea that geisha, like all Japanese citizens, were expected to contribute to the national mission. Economic realities, however, remained harsh. Many patrons reduced their spending as the war economy tightened. The luxury of geisha entertainment, once central to elite social life, became more difficult to sustain. Some ukiyo collapsed under financial strain, while others relied on a shrinking pool of patrons. Apprentices faced greater pressure to secure dana patrons, though the instability of the era made such arrangements uncertain. For many geisha, the 1930s were years of survival more than prosperity, marked by ingenuity in the face of scarcity. Despite these hardships, the geisha continued to inspire admiration. Their ability to preserve tradition, even in a militarized society, reassured citizens that Japan's cultural identity remained intact. Their presence at festivals and patriotic events reminded people that beauty and refinement could coexist with duty and sacrifice. For many Japanese, geisha symbolized continuity in a world increasingly dominated by change and conflict. Yet beneath the admiration lay fragility. The weight of debts, the decline of patrons, the intrusion of nationalism into art, all strained the geisha world. Their lives, already defined by impermanence, became even more uncertain as the prospect of war loomed. The serene smile seen at banquets concealed anxieties about the future, fears that the floating world might not survive the storms to come. By the late 1930s, as Japan marched toward war, the geisha stood at a crossroads. They had survived centuries of change by adapting, and now they faced their greatest test yet. The world they inhabited, of lantern-lit tea houses, shamisen melodies, and fleeting elegance, seemed increasingly fragile against the backdrop of military parades, propaganda, and global conflict. And yet, as always, they endured, embodying the paradox of impermanence. Blossoms that bloomed even as storms gathered, symbols of beauty in a world that seemed to be losing sight of it. When Japan entered the Second World War, the floating world of the geisha was forced into a reality unlike any it had faced before. War reached into every corner of Japanese society, reshaping economies, families, and daily routines. For the geisha, whose lives had always depended on elegance, refinement, and the delicate rhythms of patronage, the harsh demands of a wartime nation brought profound disruption. The most immediate effect of war was scarcity. Silk, once abundant for kimono, became nearly impossible to obtain as the government redirected materials to the military. Geisha, who had once dazzled in vibrant kimono, found themselves reusing older garments, patching torn seams, or substituting with cheaper fabrics. The elaborate hair ornaments of maiko, once crafted with meticulous artistry, were simplified or abandoned altogether. Makeup, too, became scarce. The white powders and delicate rouge that defined their appearance were rationed, forcing them to adapt their image with whatever substitutes they could find. Food shortages touched every household, and ukiyo were no exception. Apprentices who had once endured long days of training fueled by hearty meals now found themselves on restricted rations. Banquets, once filled with delicacies, became more modest affairs, with simple dishes replacing elaborate feasts. Yet geisha adapted, finding ways to maintain atmosphere even when abundance was gone. A well-timed joke, a haunting shamisen melody, or a graceful dance could distract guests from the absence of luxury, reminding them that beauty was not only in material richness, but in fleeting presence. The clientele of geisha shifted dramatically during the war. Many traditional patrons were drafted into military service, while others redirected their wealth to support the war effort. In their place came officers, bureaucrats, and officials tied to the state. Banquets became more somber, often infused with patriotic overtones. Geisha were expected to perform songs that celebrated loyalty and sacrifice. Their art turned into subtle instruments of propaganda. Dances once centered on cherry blossoms or moonlight were sometimes replaced or reframed as allegories of national strength. Despite this politicization, the essence of geisha performance persisted. Their ability to create an atmosphere of refinement, even in times of hardship, reassured both patrons and themselves that tradition endured. A shamisen note plucked in a dimly lit room carried the memory of peace, even as bombs fell abroad. A dance performed with restraint reminded audiences of beauty, even as scarcity gnawed at daily life. In this way, geisha became not only entertainers, but also keepers of memory, preserving a sense of normalcy amid chaos. The war also brought physical danger. Air raids threatened cities, including districts where geisha houses had stood for centuries. Kyoto, though spared the worst destruction, still experienced fear, while Tokyo and Osaka saw devastating bombings that destroyed entire neighborhoods. Some ukiyo were reduced to ashes, their histories and heirlooms lost in a single night. Geisha fled alongside ordinary citizens, carrying little more than their shamisen and a handful of kimono. The floating world, so carefully cultivated over generations, could vanish in an instant under the weight of war. For apprentices, the hardships were especially acute. Training often gave way to labor, as many were conscripted into factory work or other forms of national service. Lessons in shamisen and dance were disrupted, leaving gaps in cultural transmission. Yet even in these circumstances, some continued to practice in secret, strumming strings quietly at night or rehearsing dances in bomb shelters. Their persistence was an act of resistance, a refusal to let tradition be extinguished by conflict. Geisha also played roles in supporting morale. Performances were sometimes organized for soldiers on leave, offering brief respite from the horrors of war. These events were stripped of luxury, yet their impact was profound. To weary soldiers, the sight of a geisha dance or the sound of a shamisen was a reminder of home, of the beauty and culture they believed they fought to protect. For the geisha, these performances were bittersweet, blending pride in their role with sorrow at the sacrifices demanded by war. The financial strain of wartime proved devastating. With fewer patrons and reduced engagements, many ukiyo fell into debt. Some closed permanently, unable to sustain themselves under rationing and destruction. Others adapted by pooling resources, sharing kimono, instruments, and even apprentices. The communal bonds of the Hanamachi districts deepened as survival became a collective effort. Sisterhood, always a defining feature of geisha life, grew even stronger in these years as women relied on one another more than ever before. Yet amid all this hardship, the essence of geisha art, its grounding in impermanence, proved a source of strength. They had always celebrated the fleeting, the cherry blossom that falls as soon as it blooms, the note of music that fades into silence, the moment of laughter that vanishes with the dawn. In wartime, this philosophy became more than art. It became survival. To find beauty in the ephemeral, to create joy even when surrounded by loss, was to embody resilience in its truest form. By the war's end in 1945, the world of the geisha had been battered but not destroyed. Many houses lay in ruins, many careers had ended prematurely, many traditions had been disrupted. Yet the geisha endured, just as they had endured through centuries of change. Scarcity had stripped away luxury, but it had not erased refinement. Bombs had shattered tea houses, but they had not silenced shamisen. The geisha who survived the war emerged with scars, but also with renewed determination. To rebuild, to preserve, and to remind a shattered nation that beauty could bloom even in the aftermath of destruction, even in the darkest years of the Showa era, when the fires of war consumed cities and scarcity reshaped daily life. Geisha continued to serve as guardians of Japanese culture. Their role went far beyond entertainment. They became preservers of memory, living vessels of traditions that risked being lost in the chaos of conflict. While factories thundered, bombs fell, and soldiers marched to distant battlefields, the sound of shamisen, the flow of dance, and the quiet dignity of geisha reminded Japan of who it was. The preservation of music was central to this mission. Shamisen lessons, though disrupted by rationing and labor demands, continued wherever possible. In the back rooms of damaged ukiyo, apprentices practiced scales on worn instruments, their strings patched and their skins replaced with whatever material could be found. Senior geisha, themselves burdened with fatigue and scarcity, still gathered younger women to teach them songs passed down for generations. These lessons were acts of resistance, quiet affirmations that tradition could not be silenced by war. Dance, too, was preserved with determination. Seasonal performances, though often shortened and simplified, remained integral to the rhythm of geisha life. A dance for cherry blossoms performed in a bomb shelter or a snow dance practiced in an unheated room carried symbolic power far beyond its movements. For apprentices, learning these dances during wartime reinforced the idea that their art was not merely performance, but continuity. To embody the cycle of seasons in a world disrupted by war was to remind themselves and their audiences that life, fragile and fleeting, still followed its eternal rhythms. The rituals of ozashiki banquets also endured, though transformed. Banquets were smaller, food simpler, and patrons fewer. Yet the atmosphere created by geisha remained essential. A witty remark, a playful game, or a haunting melody lifted spirits in ways no rationed meal could. Soldiers on leave found in these evenings moments of relief, reminders of home, and of the cultural values they believed they defended. Even bureaucrats and officials, hardened by war responsibilities, softened under the charm of geisha presence. These moments of humanity, however brief, preserved a sense of normalcy amid chaos. Festivals, though curtailed, also offered opportunities for cultural preservation. In Kyoto's Gion district, dances were performed even during wartime, stripped of grandeur but infused with resilience. Audiences gathered despite fear of air raids, drawn by the reassurance that tradition endured. For many, these performances were not escapism, but acts of defiance. Proof that beauty could survive destruction, that culture could endure even when cities burned. The philosophy of impermanence that had always defined geisha art gained deeper meaning in wartime. Geisha had long celebrated the fleeting, the falling of cherry blossoms, the fading of music, the vanishing of laughter. In war, impermanence was no longer metaphor, but reality. Homes destroyed in seconds, lives lost in an instant, cities reduced to ash overnight. Yet geisha transformed this reality into resilience. By embracing impermanence, they reminded their audiences that beauty could still exist, even if only for a moment. And in that moment lay strength, hope, and survival. Geisha also preserved cultural memory through teaching. Many took on apprentices even during the war, determined that the next generation would carry forward traditions. These apprentices grew up in scarcity, learning dances in bare rooms and songs on patched instruments. Yet their training was no less rigorous than in earlier times. In fact, the hardships deepened their appreciation for the art. To learn refinement amid destruction was to internalize the essence of geisha philosophy, that beauty is most powerful when it is fragile. Their role as guardians of culture extended beyond their immediate communities. Some geisha participated in performances organized for national morale, appearing on stages to remind citizens of their heritage. Others recorded songs for radio broadcasts, their shamisen melodies reaching listeners across the nation. In these broadcasts, refinement became a form of comfort, assuring people that tradition had not been erased by the thunder of war. Yet their efforts came at great personal cost. Scarcity weighed heavily, exhaustion was constant, and danger was never far away. Air raids destroyed ukiyo, scattering communities and erasing histories preserved in ledgers, kimono, and instruments. Some geisha lost their lives in bombings, their artistry extinguished before it could be passed on. Others were forced to abandon their careers temporarily, conscripted into labor, or displaced by evacuation orders. The fragility of their world was laid bare, yet the determination to preserve culture endured. Internationally, the image of geisha during the war became more complicated. To foreign observers, they remained symbols of Japan, though often filtered through propaganda or misunderstanding. Some accounts romanticize them as timeless figures untouched by conflict. while others condemned them as part of a system of decadence incompatible with wartime austerity. Yet these portrayals failed to capture the reality. Women who, in the midst of devastation, preserved traditions with quiet strength. By the war's end, much of Japan lay in ruins, but the cultural continuity embodied by Geisha survived. Their role as guardians of tradition ensured that music, dance, and rituals remained alive, ready to be passed on to the post-war generation. Though battered, displaced, and scarred, they had fulfilled a profound duty to keep beauty alive in a time when destruction threatened to erase it. The story of Geisha during the war is thus not only one of hardship, but of preservation. They safeguarded music when instruments were scarce, practiced dance when stages were destroyed, maintained refinement when luxury was impossible. They proved that tradition could endure not through abundance, but through resilience, that impermanence could be transformed into immortality by the act of remembrance. As Japan prepared to rebuild in the aftermath of defeat, the geisha stood ready to continue their role, not only as entertainers, but as living testaments to the endurance of culture. Their survival through war ensured that the floating world, though altered forever, would remain a part of Japan's identity, a reminder that even in the darkest times, beauty can be both shield and salvation. The end of the Second World War in 1945 brought devastation and transformation to Japan. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the nation faced not only material scarcity, but also profound identity crisis. Amid this shattered landscape, the geisha, long symbols of refinement and continuity, emerged from the war-scarred yet still present. Their survival through years of conflict had been miraculous, but the post-war years would challenge them in new and unexpected ways. The Allied occupation, led by the United States, reshaped Japanese society at every level. Political reforms dismantled imperial institutions, new constitutions enshrined democratic principles, and American cultural influences flooded into daily life. For geisha, this new era was paradoxical. On one hand, their traditional roles seemed outdated in a society eager for modernization and democratization. On the other, they remained one of the clearest living symbols of Japanese culture, fascinating both foreign occupiers and Japanese citizens searching for continuity. The immediate post-war years were marked by confusion. Many geisha districts had been destroyed by bombing. Ukiyo were reduced to rubble, tea houses burned, and countless heirlooms lost forever. Surviving geisha returned to these ruins with little more than their instruments and a few salvaged kimono. Rebuilding required immense effort, often supported by collective solidarity within the hanamachi. Women shared resources, pooling garments and instruments to revive performances. Apprentices trained in makeshift spaces determined that their art would not vanish despite destruction. Scarcity remained a defining feature of daily life. Food shortages were severe, and many geisha, like ordinary citizens, struggled to find enough to eat. Kimono were patched and repurposed, instruments repaired with crude materials. Performances were stripped of luxury, yet geisha persisted in creating refinement even with the barest resources. In the glow of a single lamp, a shamisen melody could still evoke the elegance of centuries past, offering comfort to patrons and performers alike. One of the most significant challenges of the occupation was the conflation of geisha with sex workers who catered to foreign soldiers. With thousands of American servicemen stationed in Japan, demand for entertainment and companionship surged. Many women, driven by desperation, entered sex work, sometimes presenting themselves as geisha to appeal to foreign clients. This misrepresentation spread quickly among the occupiers, who often could not distinguish between true geisha and those who adopted the label for survival. As a result, the word geisha became distorted in foreign eyes. To many American soldiers, it meant simply a Japanese woman offering companionship, whether artistic or sexual. This misunderstanding deeply frustrated authentic geisha, whose lives were rooted in discipline, artistry, and cultural preservation. They found themselves fighting not only for survival, but also for the integrity of their identity. To counter these misconceptions, geisha communities worked to assert their distinction. Leaders of Hanamachi emphasized training, discipline, and tradition, making clear that geisha were artists, not courtesans. Some organized public performances explicitly designed to educate foreign audiences, showcasing shamisen, dance, and tea ceremony. Others relied on Japanese patrons who still valued authenticity, reinforcing their cultural role despite foreign misunderstandings. Over time, these efforts succeeded in restoring clarity, though the stereotype of geisha as sex workers lingered abroad for decades. Economically, the post-war years were precarious. Many former patrons had lost their wealth in the collapse of the wartime economy, leaving geisha with fewer reliable sources of support. Engagements were scarce, and fees often reduced. Some ukiyo closed permanently, unable to rebuild. Yet others adapted, embracing new patrons among the emerging business elite who would fuel Japan's eventual economic recovery. Slowly, the floating world began to stabilize, though it never returned to its pre-war scale. Despite hardships, the geisha's symbolic role as guardians of tradition became more important than ever. In a nation grappling with defeat and occupation, their presence reassured citizens that Japanese culture had not been extinguished. Performances of ancient dances, recitations of poetry, and haunting shamisen songs connected audiences to a past that seemed otherwise lost. For many, evenings with geisha were moments of solace, reminders that beauty and refinement could still exist even in the ashes of war. Foreign fascination also played a role in their survival. While misunderstandings persisted, many American officers and journalists were captivated by authentic geisha performances, writing articles and capturing photographs that spread their image abroad. Though often exoticized, these depictions helped re-establish the geisha as cultural icons rather than relics. In time, the very presence of foreigners helped elevate their status, transforming them into symbols of Japanese identity in a global context. For the geisha themselves, the post-war years demanded resilience. They rebuilt from ruins, endured scarcity, corrected misconceptions, and adapted to new patrons. Their lives, already marked by impermanence, became testimonies to survival in the face of devastation. Each performance was an act of defiance against despair. Each dance a reminder that beauty could outlast destruction. By the late 1940s, the geisha world had stabilized somewhat, though it was forever changed. The floating world was smaller, the number of active geisha reduced, and the grandeur of pre-war banquets diminished. Yet their essence endured. They had survived war, occupation, and misunderstanding, emerging as symbols of resilience. Their art, fragile yet persistent, reassured Japan that tradition was not lost but reborn in every performance. The end of the war thus marked not only a moment of survival, but also a redefinition. Geisha were no longer simply entertainers of the elite. They had become cultural ambassadors in a globalized, occupied Japan. Their survival demonstrated the enduring power of impermanence, that even amid ruins, beauty could bloom, fleeting yet unforgettable. By the late 1940s, Japan was beginning the slow process of recovery from the devastation of war. The ruins of cities still bore scars, food shortages remained a constant struggle, and the occupation continued to shape political and cultural life. Yet amid these difficulties, a fragile stability began to emerge. Schools reopened, industries restarted, and communities rebuilt. Within this atmosphere of cautious renewal, the geisha world, battered but not broken, set about reconstructing itself. The first step was physical restoration. Hanamachi districts in Kyoto, Tokyo, and Osaka, many of which had been damaged or destroyed by bombing, rebuilt tea houses and ukiyo. Wooden beams were raised once more, paper screens replaced, tatami mats laid down. The process was slow, hampered by material shortages and financial strain. But collective determination carried it forward. In Kyoto's Gion, one of the most famous districts, residents pooled resources to restore landmarks, ensuring that the district would remain a center of tradition. Equally important was the restoration of identity. The wartime years and the occupation had blurred the distinction between true geisha and women who presented themselves as such to foreign soldiers. Authentic geisha houses worked tirelessly to reclaim their name, emphasizing training, artistry, and refinement. Public performances were staged to demonstrate the difference. Shamisen music played with precision, dances rooted in centuries of tradition, tea ceremonies conducted with elegance. These displays reassured both Japanese audiences and foreign visitors that geisha were artists, not courtesans, their role grounded in culture rather than commerce. Training resumed with renewed vigor. Apprentices once again entered ukiyo as shikomi, their days filled with chores, observation, and gradual instruction. The progression to maiko and then to geisha followed rituals that had survived even the war. Dance schools reopened, their repertoires reaffirming the seasonal cycles of cherry blossoms, fireflies, autumn leaves, and snow. Shamisen instructors returned, guiding apprentices through scales and songs that linked them to the past. In these lessons, continuity triumphed over disruption. Tradition reasserted itself in every note and gesture. Economically, the early post-war years were still precarious. Patrons were fewer, their wealth diminished by inflation and economic collapse. Yet as industries recovered and new businesses emerged, a new class of patrons appeared. Businessmen connected to rebuilding efforts, officials tied to the occupation, and even foreigners curious to experience authentic Japanese culture. For many geisha, these new patrons were both opportunity and challenge. They brought fresh income and visibility, but also unfamiliar expectations. Some requested performances that blended Japanese and Western elements, while others sought the reassuring elegance of unaltered tradition. The influence of foreign visitors remained significant. Journalists, officers, and cultural figures associated with the occupation often attended geisha banquets, writing about their experiences in memoirs and articles. These accounts spread abroad, reinforcing both fascination and misunderstanding. Yet geisha adapted, presenting themselves as cultural ambassadors. They explained their rituals, introduced foreign guests to the subtleties of shamisen or dance, and in doing so, helped shape Japan's post-war identity as a nation proud of its traditions, even amid defeat. For Japanese citizens, geisha became symbols of resilience. Their survival through war and their persistence in rebuilding reminded people that cultural continuity could endure even in devastation. To attend a banquet or festival performance in the late 1940s was to participate in an act of recovery, to reclaim beauty in a world scarred by loss. The presence of geisha reassured communities that tradition had not been extinguished, that Japan's soul remained intact. Yet the post-war geisha world was not a simple restoration of the past. Modernization pressed in from every side. Western fashions and entertainments spread rapidly through cities, filling theaters, dance halls, and cabarets. Young Japanese men and women were increasingly drawn to these novelties, leaving some to question whether geisha traditions could compete. To survive, geisha once again relied on adaptability. Some experimented with incorporating new elements into their art, such as blending Western instruments with shamisen in collaborative performances. Others held firmly to tradition, presenting themselves as guardians of authenticity in a rapidly changing world. The paradox of geisha life deepened in these years. On one hand, they were admired as cultural icons, their presence celebrated by both Japanese and foreigners. On the other, they continued to face the burdens of debt, discipline, and fatigue. Apprentices worked long hours for little reward, while established geisha struggled to balance financial survival with artistic integrity. The elegance seen by patrons masked the same hidden hardships that had always defined their lives. Still, moments of triumph illuminated their efforts. In 1949, Kyoto's Gion district held a series of public performances to mark its recovery, drawing large crowds who marveled at the return of refinement. Newspapers celebrated the event as proof that Japanese culture endured even after the devastation of war. Similar events took place in other cities, reinforcing the symbolic role of geisha as cultural survivors. These performances were not only entertainment, but declarations of continuity, affirmations that beauty had outlasted destruction. By the early 1950s, the geisha world had stabilized, though it was smaller than before the war. The number of active geisha was reduced. Many ukiyo never reopened, and the grandeur of pre-war banquets was gone. Yet the essence of the profession endured. The shamisen still played, the dances still unfolded, the tea still poured with elegance. Geisha had proven once again that impermanence was not defeat, but resilience, that survival was possible even in the face of devastation. In these years, the geisha were not only entertainers, but symbols of national identity. They reassured citizens that tradition endured, inspired foreigners with their artistry, and embodied the resilience of a culture that had withstood war, defeat, and occupation. Their survival in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a triumph not only for themselves, but for Japan as a whole. A reminder that beauty could flourish even amid ruins, fleeting yet eternal. By the 1950s, Japan was a nation in transition. The devastation of war was slowly receding, replaced by a determination to rebuild and reimagine the future. Cities once reduced to rubble began to hum with industry. Shops filled again with goods, and families who had endured years of scarcity looked forward to stability. For the geisha, this decade marked a period of both revival and redefinition. They had survived the fires of war and the hardships of occupation. Now they faced the challenge of securing their place in a society rushing headlong into modernization and economic recovery. The Hanamachi districts, once fragile in the immediate aftermath of war, began to flourish again. Rebuilt tea houses reopened their doors, their lanterns glowing once more in the evening streets. Ukiyo reorganized themselves, training new generations of maiko to ensure the continuity of tradition. In Kyoto's Gion and Tokyo's Shinbashi, the return of public performances drew crowds, reminding citizens of the elegance that had defined these districts for centuries. The floating world, though smaller than before, reasserted itself as a vital part of Japan's cultural landscape. The 1950s also brought new patrons. Japan's economy, though still fragile, began to stabilize, and a new class of businessmen, entrepreneurs, industrial leaders, and corporate officials emerged as supporters of geisha culture. For these men, entertaining clients in the company of geisha was not only about personal enjoyment, but also about business strategy. Deals were discussed over shamisen music and sake. Relationships strengthened through shared evenings in tea houses. The ozashiki once again became spaces where commerce and culture intertwined. At the same time, foreign visitors continued to shape the geisha's role. Journalists, diplomats, and tourists drawn to post-war Japan often sought authentic cultural experiences, and geisha were eager to provide them. Special performances were staged for international audiences, sometimes accompanied by explanations of the symbolism in the dances and songs. These encounters helped restore the reputation of geisha abroad, countering the wartime confusion that had conflated them with sex workers. Instead, geisha reasserted themselves as artists and cultural ambassadors, figures who embodied refinement and continuity. The influence of mass media grew stronger in this decade. Magazines published photo spreads of famous geisha, while radio programs occasionally featured their songs. Films, too, depicted geisha life, sometimes idealizing their elegance, sometimes exploring the struggles behind the scenes. These portrayals reinforced the fascination of the public, ensuring that geisha remained part of the national imagination. For many Japanese who never entered a tea house, cinema and magazines were their primary window into the floating world. Training in the 1950s maintained its rigor. Apprentices still entered ukiyo as shikomi, scrubbing floors and observing their seniors. The progression to maiko and geisha followed familiar rituals, marked by elaborate hairstyles, vibrant kimono, and public debut ceremonies. Lessons in shamisen, dance, calligraphy, and conversation continued with discipline. Though some instructors experimented with incorporating modern themes into traditional repertoire, a new generation of geisha emerged, trained in the same spirit as their predecessors, but shaped by the realities of a post-war society. Economically, the burdens of the profession persisted. Kimono remained costly, training expensive, and debts heavy. Many geisha relied on dana patrons to ease these burdens, though the nature of patronage shifted in this era. Businessmen often preferred shorter-term arrangements rather than lifelong commitments, reflecting the faster pace of modern life. For geisha, this meant less stability, but also greater independence, as their livelihoods became less tied to a single patron. The balance between dependence and autonomy, always delicate, took on new dimensions in the 1950s. The image of geisha in society reflected broader cultural tensions. To many, they symbolized resilience and tradition, proof that Japan's identity had survived war and occupation. Their presence reassured citizens that refinement still mattered in an industrial age. Yet critics argued that they were outdated, distractions from the hard work of rebuilding and modernization. Feminist voices, growing stronger in post-war Japan, questioned why geisha were celebrated while most women remained confined to domestic roles or factory labor. These debates echoed those of earlier eras, but carried new urgency in a nation rethinking its values. For the geisha themselves, the decade was marked by both pride and uncertainty. They took pride in their survival and in their role as guardians of tradition, yet they also sensed the shifting currents of society. Western fashions and entertainments, dance halls, jazz clubs, and cinemas competed for attention, drawing younger audiences away from traditional forms. The challenge was not only to preserve their art, but also to prove its relevance in a world enamored with modernity. Despite these challenges, the 1950s saw moments of triumph. Annual performances such as Kyoto's Miyako Odori regained their splendor, attracting both Japanese and foreign audiences. These grand showcases, featuring dozens of geisha and maiko performing elaborate dances, became symbols of cultural continuity. Newspapers praised them as evidence of Japan's artistic vitality, while audiences marveled at the spectacle of tradition reborn after the devastation of war. By the end of the decade, the geisha world had firmly re-established itself, though in a smaller and more focused form. The number of geisha was reduced compared to pre-war years, but their visibility and influence remained strong. They had adapted once again, proving that impermanence was not fragility, but resilience. Their art, grounded in fleeting beauty, had survived war, occupation, and modernization, emerging as a vital part of Japan's post-war identity. The 1950s thus stand as a chapter of cautious renewal in geisha history. It was a decade when they rebuilt their districts, reclaimed their identity, adapted to new patrons, and reaffirmed their cultural role. They were not relics of the past, but living traditions, blossoms that had survived fire and ash to bloom once more. And in their resilience lay a message for Japan itself, that beauty, though fleeting, could outlast destruction, and that impermanence, embraced with grace, could become immortality. By the late 1950s, Japan was no longer simply recovering from war. It was transforming. Factories expanded, cities gleamed with neon lights, and a new middle class grew with unprecedented speed. In this dynamic landscape, the geisha faced both renewed appreciation and mounting competition. Their world, once shaken to its foundations, was regaining stability, but it now had to contend with an entirely new cultural environment shaped by modern entertainment and global influence. The Hanamachi districts reasserted themselves as cultural centers. In Kyoto, Gian's lanterns glowed brighter than ever, drawing visitors from across the nation. Tokyo's Shinbashi and Akasaka hosted banquets where businessmen discussed deals under the watchful guidance of geisha. These districts became havens of refinement, offering an oasis of calm and elegance in cities increasingly defined by speed, industry, and commerce. Patrons who entered these tea houses often remarked on the contrast. Outside, neon and traffic. Inside, tatami mats, shamisen melodies, and the timeless grace of geisha art. The economic boom of the late 1950s created new opportunities. Corporations flush with post-war success turned to geisha districts for client entertainment, reviving the practice of ozashiki banquets as spaces for negotiation and alliance. For geisha, this meant renewed financial stability, as corporate accounts provided steady streams of engagements. Yet this prosperity also came with pressure. Business patrons often expected geisha to adapt their performances to modern sensibilities, balancing tradition with novelty to satisfy a generation shaped by radio, cinema, and jazz. Cultural diplomacy also grew in importance. As Japan sought to rejoin the international community after the war, geisha were frequently showcased to foreign dignitaries and visitors. Official banquets often included geisha performances, framed as demonstrations of Japan's unique cultural heritage. For diplomats, these encounters offered more than entertainment. They were symbols of Japan's resilience, evidence that the nation could modernize without losing its traditions. Geisha thus became informal ambassadors, their gestures and songs carrying political weight alongside artistic value. Mass media amplified their presence. Magazines published features on celebrated geisha, presenting them as icons of elegance in an increasingly modern nation. Photographs circulated widely, both within Japan and abroad, showing women in vibrant kimono against backdrops of neon-lit cities, symbols of continuity in transformation. Films of the era often included geisha characters, some romanticized as tragic heroines, others portrayed as shrewd participants in modern life. These depictions both reinforced fascination and revealed the tensions of their role in a society straddling old and new. Yet modern entertainment posed real challenges. Cabaret clubs, dance halls, and Western-style bars flourished in post-war cities, offering lively music, casual companionship, and a sense of modern glamour. For many younger men and women, these venues were more accessible, less bound by formality, and often cheaper than ozashiki banquets. The rise of popular singers and film stars created new icons of beauty, competing with geisha for public attention. While geisha represented timeless refinement, the modern age increasingly celebrated spontaneity, energy, and spectacle. Geisha responded with adaptation. Some districts emphasized strict tradition, presenting themselves as guardians of authenticity untouched by modern trends. Others experimented with incorporating modern elements into their repertoire, occasionally blending Western instruments with shamisen or including modern themes in seasonal dances. A few geisha even appeared on television, their performances broadcast to audiences far beyond the hanamachi. These strategies ensured visibility, but they also provoked debates. Should geisha evolve with the times, or should they remain timeless? For the geisha themselves, the late 1950s and early 1960s were years of both pride and unease. They had survived devastation and rebuilt their world. They once again entertained patrons in spaces filled with music and laughter. Yet they also sensed the shifting ground beneath their feet. Younger generations were drawn to cabarets and jazz clubs, while corporations increasingly valued efficiency over ritual. Some geisha worried that their art might be admired, but not truly understood. Celebrated as heritage yet disconnected from everyday life. Despite these concerns, moments of brilliance defined the era. Kyoto's Miyako Odori performances, revived with full splendor, drew audiences from around the world, reinforcing the city's identity as a cultural capital. International visitors marveled at the precision of the dances, the elegance of the costumes, the haunting sound of shamisen. These grand performances symbolized not only the resilience of geisha, but also the endurance of Japanese culture itself, reborn in the post-war age. By the early 1960s, the geisha world had settled into a delicate balance. It was smaller than in the pre-war years, its numbers reduced, its exclusivity sharpened. Yet it remained vital, sustained by corporate patronage, cultural diplomacy, and the determination of women who carried forward centuries of tradition. They were no longer the dominant entertainers of urban life, but neither were they relics. Instead, they occupied a unique position. Artists of impermanence in a world of speed, symbols of continuity in a society rushing toward the future. The geisha of this era embodied resilience not only in survival, but in reinvention. They proved that tradition could coexist with modernity, that refinement could adapt to neon and jazz, that beauty could endure even when overshadowed by spectacle. Their story in the late 1950s and early 1960s was not one of decline, but of transformation. An affirmation that impermanence, embraced with grace, was the secret to endurance. The 1960s were years of astonishing transformation for Japan. Economic growth surged at unprecedented rates, turning the nation into one of the world's leading industrial powers. Cities expanded with skyscrapers, highways, and neon-lit districts. Television became a fixture in every household, broadcasting images and stories that shaped national identity. In this era of energy and ambition, the world of the geisha persisted, though increasingly overshadowed by new forms of entertainment and cultural expression. For the Hanamachi, the decade was paradoxical. On the one hand, prosperity brought renewed patronage. Corporations, flush with profits from exports and industry, continued to use ozashiki banquets as spaces for negotiation and celebration. To host clients in the company of geisha was still a mark of refinement, an assurance that business was conducted with cultural sophistication. On the other hand, the scale of participation narrowed. Corporate elites dominated these banquets, while ordinary citizens turned to modern entertainments more accessible and affordable. Television transformed the cultural landscape. Popular singers, actors, and comedians became household names, capturing attention once reserved for geisha. Variety shows featured music, comedy, and drama, offering entertainment to millions at once. For younger generations, the allure of television stars far outshone the exclusivity of geisha performances. While the banquet required wealth, connections, and formality, television offered spectacle freely every night in the intimacy of the home. Cinemas and cabarets added to the competition. Jazz clubs thrived, nightclubs offered lively dancing, and Western fashions spread rapidly among the youth. In Tokyo's Ginza, or Osaka's Dotonbori, neon signs advertised an endless array of modern pleasures. Against this backdrop, the geisha districts seemed increasingly like enclaves of tradition, admired but remote from the mainstream of urban life. Geisha responded in different ways. Some hanamachi emphasized their role as cultural treasures, doubling down on tradition. They presented themselves as custodians of Japanese heritage, offering experiences that contrasted sharply with the speed and noise of modern entertainment. These districts attracted foreign visitors, diplomats, and cultural enthusiasts eager to glimpse authentic Japan. Kyoto's Gion, in particular, flourished as a site of heritage tourism, where performances like the Miyako Odori drew international audiences. Other districts experimented with adaptation. Some geisha appeared on television, performing dances or shamisen pieces on cultural programs. Others participated in collaborations that blended traditional music with modern sounds, appealing to audiences curious about fusion. While such innovations sparked debates within the geisha community, they also demonstrated resilience, showing that refinement could coexist with novelty. For the geisha themselves, the 1960s were marked by a sharpening of contrasts. On the one hand, corporate patronage brought steady income to established geisha, allowing them to continue their art with dignity. On the other, apprentices faced diminishing opportunities. Fewer young girls entered ukiyo. As education expanded and families sought careers for their daughters in offices, schools, and new professions, becoming a geisha was increasingly a matter of choice rather than necessity. And the number of maiko declined. This decline deepened the sense that geisha were becoming symbols rather than central figures of urban life. To many Japanese, they represented continuity with the past rather than participation in the present. They were admired for their elegance, yet their role in everyday culture was increasingly ceremonial, confined to banquets, festivals, and cultural showcases. For some geisha, this shift was a source of pride. They were guardians of tradition in a restless age. For others, it was a source of melancholy, a reminder that their art, though admired, was slipping out of the mainstream. Internationally, however, fascination with geisha remained strong. Foreign tourists arriving in Japan during the 1960s often sought out geisha districts, eager to see women they had read about in books or seen in films. Travel guides promoted geisha as essential to the Japanese experience, and photographs of maiko in elaborate kimono circulated widely. This foreign attention helped sustain geisha economically, even as domestic audiences drifted toward modern entertainment. Yet the image of geisha abroad was often shaped by misunderstanding. Many continued to conflate them with courtesans, reducing their role to stereotypes. Geisha themselves, aware of this, made deliberate efforts to emphasize artistry in their interactions with foreign guests. Dances, songs, and tea ceremonies were framed not as luxuries, but as cultural heritage, offered to educate as much as to entertain. In doing so, they reinforced their role as ambassadors of Japanese tradition. The philosophy of impermanence that had always defined geisha art gained new relevance in this decade. Surrounded by the speed of economic growth, the noise of television, and the flash of neon, the fleeting elegance of a dance or the fading note of shamisen seemed more poignant than ever. To attend a geisha performance in the 1960s was to step into a space where time slowed, where refinement resisted the rush of modernity. For many patrons, this contrast was the greatest value geisha offered. Not competition with television or cinema, but an alternative to them. By the end of the decade, the number of geisha had declined significantly compared to pre-war levels. Yet those who remained had carved out a role that was both narrower and deeper. They were less central to popular culture, but more firmly identified as symbols of heritage. Their performances were rarer, but more celebrated, their presence smaller in scale, but greater in symbolic weight. The 1960s thus marked a turning point. Geisha were no longer the entertainers of the masses, or even of the broader elite. They had become guardians of tradition in an industrial society, admired at home and abroad as living symbols of refinement. Their story in this decade was not one of disappearance, but of transformation, an adjustment to impermanence once more. Proof that survival lies not in resisting change, but in flowing with it, like blossoms carried on the wind. The 1970s marked a decade of confidence for Japan. The post-war economic miracle had transformed the nation into a global industrial power. Bullet trains connected cities at unprecedented speed, skyscrapers rose above neon-lit streets, and consumer culture flourished with televisions, cars, and luxury goods filling households. For many Japanese, life in the 1970s meant prosperity and progress, a sharp contrast to the scarcity and austerity of earlier decades. In this world of abundance, the geisha occupied a paradoxical place. On one hand, they remained visible symbols of cultural continuity, admired by Japanese citizens and foreign visitors alike. On the other, their profession seemed increasingly distant from the everyday life of modern Japan. The Hanamachi districts glowed with tradition, yet they now stood as islands of refinement surrounded by the sea of modern consumer culture. Corporate patronage remained central to their survival. As companies expanded and competed internationally, business entertainment became an essential tool. Hosting clients in the presence of geisha was still considered the height of sophistication, signaling not only wealth but also a deep connection to Japanese heritage. Ozashiki banquets in Kyoto or Tokyo served as stages where contracts were sealed over sake and shamisen melodies. Yet even here, change was evident. The informality of modern corporate culture sometimes clashed with the rituals of geisha entertainment, leading some younger executives to favor restaurants or cabarets over traditional tea houses. Tourism, both domestic and international, grew significantly during this decade, providing new sources of income. Kyoto's Gion district became a focal point for cultural tourism, with visitors eager to witness the grace of Maiko and geisha. The Miyako Odori and similar performances were marketed as must-see events, blending authenticity with theatricality to appeal to audiences unfamiliar with the subtleties of geisha art. For many Japanese families visiting Kyoto, attending such a performance was less about personal refinement and more about cultural education. An encounter with a heritage that seemed increasingly distant from their daily lives. The spread of mass media continued to shape perceptions. Television dramas occasionally featured geisha characters, often romanticized as tragic figures navigating love and duty. Magazines published glossy photo spreads of famous Maiko, portraying them as icons of timeless beauty. Yet these portrayals also risked turning geisha into symbols frozen in the past, admired but disconnected from the realities of contemporary society. For the geisha themselves, the 1970s were years of both stability and decline. Stability came from corporate sponsorships and tourism, which provided steady, if uneven, streams of income. Decline came from shrinking numbers. Fewer young women chose to enter ukiyo, as educational and professional opportunities for women expanded dramatically. College enrollment for women increased, office work became more accessible, and the idea of becoming a geisha was no longer seen as one of the few respectable paths to independence. As a result, The population of active geisha fell steadily, concentrating the profession in a handful of districts. This decline forced the hanamachi to rethink their strategies. Some emphasized exclusivity, presenting themselves as rarefied spaces accessible only to those who truly valued refinement. Others leaned into tourism, offering more public performances to sustain their communities. The balance between secrecy and visibility, always a defining tension of geisha culture, shifted toward visibility as survival demanded broader audiences. At the same time, geisha continued to inspire fascination abroad. Foreign tourists, encouraged by Japan's growing international profile, flocked to Kyoto, eager to glimpse the women they had seen in films and books. For many, geisha embodied the essence of Japanese tradition, a living symbol of elegance untouched by modernity. While misunderstandings persisted, geisha adapted by presenting themselves deliberately as cultural ambassadors, explaining their art and rituals to foreign guests with clarity and pride. The philosophy of impermanence remained at the heart of their resilience. In a society increasingly defined by consumer goods and rapid change, geisha performances offered a different rhythm. Slower, subtler, grounded in centuries of refinement. A shamisen note fading into silence, a dance evoking falling blossoms, a cup of tea poured with precision, all stood in stark contrast to the speed and spectacle of modern life. Patrons often remarked that an evening with geisha felt like stepping into another world, one where time itself moved differently. Yet beneath the elegance, challenges deepened. Financial pressures persisted, with the costs of kimono, training, and maintenance rising, even as the number of patrons declined. The reliance on dana patrons diminished, as corporate culture shifted away from long-term personal sponsorships. Geisha increasingly relied on group banquets and public performances rather than individual patronage. For many, this meant greater independence, but also less security, as income fluctuated with economic trends. By the end of the 1970s, the geisha world had become smaller, more specialized, and more symbolic. They were no longer central to urban entertainment, yet their presence carried enormous cultural weight. They had survived war, occupation, and modernization, and now they survived by positioning themselves as guardians of tradition in a society rushing toward the future. Their story in this decade was one of quiet endurance, fewer in number, but no less graceful. Their art adapted yet unchanged, their presence fragile yet enduring. The 1970s thus marked another turning point in geisha history. They were no longer entertainers of the masses or even of the broader elite. They had become heritage, cultural treasures admired at home and abroad, blossoms that bloomed more rarely, but whose beauty was all the more cherished for its scarcity. In an age of speed and abundance, the geisha reminded Japan that refinement lay not in spectacle, but in presence, not in permanence, but in the fleeting elegance of impermanence. By the 1980s, Japan had entered a new stage of prosperity. The post-war economic miracle had reached its zenith, with Tokyo emerging as one of the world's financial capitals. Corporate towers gleamed, consumer culture thrived, and Japan's global influence expanded across industries and the arts. Within this booming society, the geisha endured, not as central figures in entertainment, but as cultural icons whose significance had shifted from everyday presence to symbolic heritage. The hanamachi districts were fewer but more defined. Kyoto's Gion, Tokyo's Shinbashi and Akasaka, and a handful of others remained the primary centers of geisha life. Within these districts, ukiyo continued to train apprentices, though their numbers had dwindled. The decline was undeniable. Fewer young women chose to enter the profession, preferring opportunities in universities, corporations, and creative industries. Yet those who did commit to the path of geisha often did so with a sense of deliberate vocation, seeing themselves not merely as entertainers, but as custodians of cultural tradition. Corporate patronage persisted, though it was more ceremonial than ever. Business executives hosted clients at ozashiki banquets, where the presence of geisha signaled refinement and continuity with Japanese heritage. Yet the atmosphere was often more symbolic than functional, with many guests attending less for the art itself than for the prestige of the experience. For geisha, this meant that their role was shifting from essential participants in the fabric of elite social life to curated representatives of tradition. Tourism, both domestic and international, grew enormously during this period. Japan's rising profile on the global stage attracted visitors eager to encounter geisha firsthand. Guided tours of Kyoto often highlighted glimpses of maiko walking to appointments, their brightly colored kimono and elaborate hairstyles serving as living icons of Japan's cultural identity. Public performances, such as the Miyako Odori, became major tourist attractions attended not only by Japanese audiences, but by travelers from Europe, America, and beyond. In these settings, geisha functioned as ambassadors of tradition, their art transformed into a symbol of national pride for global display. The Japanese government itself recognized their significance. Efforts to preserve intangible cultural heritage elevated geisha arts to the level of national treasures. Dance schools, shamisen lineages, and performance traditions were officially designated for protection, ensuring that their transmission would continue. For the first time, geisha culture was not only sustained by ukiyo and patrons, but also by institutional recognition. This shift reflected a broader understanding. Geisha were no longer merely entertainers. They were heritage. Mass media reinforced this perception. Documentaries, magazine features, and coffee table books celebrated the elegance of geisha, often framing them as timeless relics of the past. Films and television dramas depicted their lives with a mixture of romanticism and realism, acknowledging both the grace of their performances and the hardships behind them. For many Japanese, geisha became less a part of lived experience and more a symbol of cultural continuity, admired from a distance rather than encountered directly. For the geisha themselves, the 1980s were years of pride tempered by fragility. They had survived centuries of upheaval, from the collapse of the shogunate to the fires of war, from occupation to modernization. Now, they stood as living testaments to resilience, their art admired around the world. Yet they were also acutely aware of their declining numbers, the shrinking scale of their communities, and the challenges of sustaining their traditions in a rapidly globalizing society. The daily routines of training, however, remained unchanged. Apprentices still entered ukiyo as shikomi, advanced to maiko, and eventually debuted as geisha. They still studied shamisen, dance, calligraphy, and conversation, their lives shaped by discipline and refinement. The rituals of performance, the elegance of kimono, the precision of gestures, all persisted, reminders that even in an age of computers and skyscrapers, some traditions remained untouched. Internationally, the fascination with geisha deepened. Photographs of Maiko appeared in glossy magazines worldwide, while travel accounts highlighted encounters with them as quintessentially Japanese experiences. Yet misunderstandings persisted, with many foreigners continuing to conflate geisha with courtesans. Geisha communities responded by emphasizing education, offering cultural programs and exhibitions that explained their role as artists and preservers of tradition. Slowly, their message gained traction, reframing them in the global imagination as symbols of elegance rather than stereotypes. The philosophy of impermanence remained their guiding strength. In an era when Japan seemed to embrace speed, wealth, and permanence through skyscrapers and economic power, the fleeting grace of geisha performances offered a reminder of another truth: that beauty lies in the moment, not in its duration. A single shamisen note, a fleeting smile, a dance step dissolving into silence. These were reminders of values deeper than material abundance. Patrons often remarked that an evening with geisha felt like stepping out of time, a pause in the relentless forward motion of modern life. By the close of the 1980s, the geisha had become fewer in number, but greater in symbolic weight. They were not everyday entertainers, but curated treasures, preserved by tradition, patronage, and government recognition. Their survival into the modern age was a triumph of adaptation, a testament to the power of impermanence. They had endured war, scarcity, modernization, and cultural shifts, emerging as living heritage in a nation that both revered and transformed them. The late Showa era thus marked the final stage of transformation for the geisha as participants in modern society. They had shifted from entertainers of the elite to guardians of tradition, from figures of everyday refinement to icons of heritage. Their art endured not because it resisted change, but because it embraced impermanence, flowing with the currents of history while preserving its essence. Thank you, dear listener, for staying with me through this part of our journey into the world of the geisha. Together, we have explored their early traditions, their rules, and the structures that shaped their lives. We've seen how art and discipline wove together, and how the floating world began to flourish with elegance and resilience. But the story is far from finished. In the next part, we will step even deeper into the hidden layers of their lives, their artistry, their philosophies, and the meanings that carried them across centuries. If this story has brought you peace or inspiration, please share in the comments where in the world you are listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing how far this journey travels. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the continuation of this long and beautiful story. Until next time, may your nights be calm and your days filled with quiet beauty.